to the lecture introducing you to early colonial New England. In addition to the questions covered in chapters 8 and 9, you'll be watching We Shall Remain After the Mayflower, and also listening to this video and this lecture about early New England. Okay? And remember, those of you who do well are going to include elements from the book, the film, and this lecture in order to answer your questions. So, why did the British colonists come to New England? Well, the standard narrative in traditional tellings of U.S. history is that the British came for religious freedom. However, the truth is somewhat more complicated than that. They did want religious freedom. They wanted the freedom to worship as they saw fit. However, no other forms of Christianity, much less Islam or the Jewish religion, were allowed to be practiced in colonial New England. We will see how that unfolds. To back up a little and understand why this was the case, let's once again return to a map of the European religions in the middle of the 1500s. And as you'll see, only Spain, Italy, and Western Ireland and Portugal are Catholic at this time, Roman Catholic. Roman Catholic because the head of the Christian church at this time was in Rome. If this map was dated 1460, all of Western Europe would be that light blue color. However, in the 1500s, a series of reformers changed Christianity forever. For example, but before we look at the changes in Christianity, let's look at the role the Catholic Church played in Christian Europe for 1,000 years, from 500 to 1500 AD. So the Christian bishop, the number one bishop, who we call the Pope, is in Rome, and the church was not only responsible for helping your soul, your immortal soul, get to heaven, and we have this exemplified by Jesus in the middle of this image, surrounded by his posse of saints. This whole army of saints are going to help you ward off evil and the devil and his minions who are at work in the world, very much so in the world for believers, fighting for your soul, this battle between good and evil. And if you were a Christian believer, you would have friends to help you. You would have saints to help you get to heaven. However, the church also was involved in very real earthly endeavors, such as they ran the only orphanages in Europe, the only schools, the only hospitals, and yes, the only banks. If you wanted to borrow money to buy a cow and increase your cattle, dairy, farm production, you would go borrow money from the church. So not only were they involved in religious affairs, they were involved in everyday affairs. And the church in Rome grew in power and strength and wealth, and many Christians asked themselves, well, what would Jesus think if he walked into, for example, this opulent St. Peter's Cathedral? They argued that Jesus would be very upset that a rich person, for example, could buy indulgences to help him get to heaven and have God forgive his sins. So many felt that the opulent churches here, gilded in gold here at St. Peter's Cathedral, was just too much. However, Henry VIII, he broke with the church, not necessarily for religious reasons, but he wanted to marry somebody else to have an heir to the throne, and he wanted to force Catherine of Aragon, but the Pope wouldn't allow him for personal and political reasons. So he simply broke away from the church and created his own Christian church, and he named it the Anglican Church. That just is another word for England, in which he was the head. So not only did he break away from the church, he confiscated Catholic Church lands in England, doled them out to his allies. Thereby, the Anglican Church would receive the revenues and the taxes once funneled to the Catholic Church. So it was very much a political and economic and social revolution that King Henry VIII started. About the same time, this Protestant theologian in Germany, Martin Luther, will come to be the founder of what became the Lutheran version of Christianity. He argued in his many critiques of the Catholic Church that you don't need to do good works to go to heaven. You don't need all this intricate Catholic rituals. All you need is your faith and the book, the good book. And here's a copy of the Bible that Martin Luther wrote in German. So only sola fides, only through faith and only through book you can find heaven. You can find Jesus and receive salvation. And it wasn't just Martin Luther and Henry VIII. So many other Christian reformers were coming up with their own critiques and definitions of what it meant to be a Christian. For example, John Calvin, this Frenchman who moved to Geneva, wrote the Geneva Bible. And in it, he talked about how the true Christianity for him, the Reformed Christianity, was based on predestination, in which when God created the world, he had already decided who's going to go to heaven and hell, right? And it's good works are unnecessary for one to achieve salvation. John Calvin also emphasized the separation from the state. So many believers of Calvinism took this to the extreme that they would not even swear loyalty or allegiance to any state. Their loyalty and allegiance was to a higher power. And it's the Calvinists who leave Europe and go on a pilgrimage to the New World. This is why we call the pilgrims the pilgrims. They are on a pilgrimage. Many other more radical versions of Christianity also emerged. We had the Anabaptists, who said that, well, if we're going to reject the Pope in Rome, we're going to reject many vestiges of that Christianity. So many did not wear wedding rings. They swore no oaths to any government. They did not want to embark in any war or bloodshed in the name of a state. They thought that was sacrilege. You can imagine that not many leaders of kingdoms liked the Anabaptists, and Martin Luther did not like them either. The Quakers began at this time. The Quakers were even more radical. They called themselves the Society of Friends, in which all hierarchies were thrown out. There was no more hierarchical situation in which you had God at the top, the Pope, the bishops, and then the lay people, lay Christians. This saw everybody as equals to such an extent that even women were allowed to speak in churches. If the Spirit called to them, they were allowed to speak. This is the only Christian sect at the time that allowed women to speak in church. There was no head of the Society of Friends Church, the Quakers, and they practiced communal living. If property, the idea of private property was seen as a vestige of the old corrupt church, then we will live communally. Needless to say, the Anabaptists, the Quakers, and many other fringe elements of Christianity were persecuted by Lutherans, Calvinists, and the Catholic Church, of course. Finally, I just want to touch on the antinomianism. The antinomians, they felt that, hey, if it's only faith alone that gets you to heaven, then they practiced free love, no state. They rejected all the institutional hierarchies that were imposed by church fathers in the Catholic Church. Here's an image that Martin Luther penned critiquing all these different Christianities which had emerged after the first break from the Catholic Church. And for many in Western Europe, it did seem like the world had turned upside down. After 1,000 years of the Church in Rome dictating Catholic dogma and spirituality, now that there's all these different religions vying for your soul, vying for property, vying for your tax that everybody paid a percentage of their wealth to the church. Now different churches were vying for that. It did seem that the world had turned upside down. as exemplified in this image in which this guy's head's growing out of his crotch. The castle's upside down, the fish are flying. Looks like some Gabriel Garcia Marquez novel. And all sides used propaganda. Propaganda didn't have the negative connotations that it does now. Both sides practiced this propaganda war to critique the other and to promote themselves. Here's Luther in a rather crude depiction of these critiques of the Pope, showing their behinds to the Pope and farting on him, basically. The Catholic Church came back with their own series of propaganda, and the Western Europe's landscape, religious landscape, is covered in this religious propaganda wars. Here's Mother Mary taking down the heretics. You see the heretics are wrestling with the snake of the devil, and Mother Mary, the Church's Mother Mary's angel, is ripping up the heretical Bibles. So this is the context in which the separatists from England, practicing Calvin's version of Christianity, leave England. They get kicked out of England by the authorities, and they go to the land of religious freedom, which at that time is Holland. Holland welcomed those who were persecuted throughout Europe. Holland welcomed them. So in Holland, it's this interesting mix of foreign-speaking Quakers and Jews and Protestants and Catholics who were not welcomed in the lands of their birth because of these religious wars that were sweeping Europe. And they lived in Holland, and for the Dutch, it was in one way, a brilliant way to get those disaffected folks and those persecuted folks into Holland, and to help make Holland a very wealthy, diverse early republic. However, there's a problem with the separatists. They did not go to Holland to celebrate religious diversity. They wanted to do things their own way, and they found that Holland was a little too free for them. They did not like it. Plus, these English Calvinists who wanted to separate themselves found their children hanging out with all these other Christianities and not being as pure or Puritan as they wished. So the separatists, once again, they go back to the King James of England, and they said, hey, we want to join your colonial ventures in the Americas. And yes, we'll behave. Yes, we'll be good, loyal subjects. They wanted out of Holland because it was too free. So they end the Virginia Company Charter. Remember, this group of investors did agree to invest in these pilgrims' desire to go to the Americas. However, the first ship, the Mayflower, the first ship of colonists to go to New England weren't all pilgrims, right? Look at 15 planter men with their families, with 37 separatist men and their families. Once again, very different than Virginia, if you remember. Virginia, it was all men going, gentlemen going. New England, families are going. And you'll see how this will play out and differentiate New England from Virginia. However, the Virginia Company Charter said you must go to Virginia. This is the only British colony in the Americas. However, in November 11, 1620, they arrive hundreds of miles to the north in Cape Cod, what is today Cape Cod, Massachusetts. The fourth largest harbor in the world. It's very rich. They got a map of the reason why they knew about New England was when John Smith left or was kicked out of Virginia. He drew a map of New England, a rather accurate map of New England, and the separatists looked at this and said, hey, that might be the place for us. Let's go. But what are they to do? This group of pilgrims and others had agreed to the Virginia Charter to join the Virginia settlement in Jamestown. However, they didn't go to Jamestown. They went hundreds of miles north. So they had to do something. So still while on the ship, before they disembarked onto land, 41 of the 44 free men voted and agreed to the following charter. Remember, women are not allowed to vote, not for another 300 years, and the indentured servants on board are not allowed to vote. So what they agreed upon was this new charter. They created this wholly new charter independent of the Virginia Company Charter. And it says the following, and if any good Massachusetts student is so proud of this charter because they think that American democracy started in Massachusetts and they may have an argument. Here it goes. This is the charter upon which they agreed. In the name of God, amen. They always start like this, the Puritans. We whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign, Lord King James, by the grace of God of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, defender of the faith, etc., having undertaken for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith and honor of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by these presents solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one another, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid, and by virtue hereof to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices, from time to time as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, under which we promise all due submission and obedience. I know, a lot of words, 17th century English. There needs to be a couple periods, right, for us to understand it better as us moderns. But basically, after these new settlers honor the king and accept him as their sovereign, right, they butter him up. They say, we are in the northern parts of Virginia. They're redefining where they're going, which is very far away from Virginia. But more importantly, they say we mutually, in the presence of God and one another. So here we go. Not only are they defining their colony as one in which God has given right to, but one another. This is a democratization movement of a kind. So what are they going to do? They're going to create a covenant and combine themselves together into a civil body politic. They're going to make their own government for themselves. They're also going to pass laws, ordinances, acts, and offices, and from time to time change them for the general good of the colony. In other words, they are promising all due submission and obedience to the colony, not necessarily King James and the furtherance of this Virginia colony. They know they're making something completely new, and in that vein, they go and elect a governor. All other colonies that we'll see that the British set up in America, they are given a governor and named a governor by the king. This one in Massachusetts, they elect their own governor. This is unique, very unique. So what happens when the English arrive? The English arrive, they created this new charter, they're venturing into new sort of political and literally new territory. And they landed in Massachusetts and found villages empty. Literally, they would go into an Indian village and the structures would still be up, yet nobody would be there. Or else there'd be one or two people wandering about in dissolution, very sad because 90% of the Wampanoags in New England died of disease, this smallpox disease that swept through New England 3 years before the Pilgrims actually arrive. Not surprisingly, many pilgrims saw this as part of God's benevolence, how God is clearing out these lands for the new settlers. However, even though the British arrive to emptied areas from disease, the population had plummeted. Like the Virginia colonists, they're suffering, they're dying from disease, from not really knowing how to farm. A lot of these first settlers were city people, so they didn't know how to farm. So what happened was the local Wampanoags, led by this bilingual person, Tisquantum, we know him as Squanto. Squanto had been kidnapped by Spanish, made his way to England as a slave, learned the English language, and then found his way back to Massachusetts. Interesting story all on its own. He was the intermediary between the Pilgrims and the local Wampanoags. So Squanto taught the Pilgrims how to plant, fertilize, hunt eels, how to survive. A lot like Powhatan helped the first Virginians to survive in the Chesapeake region. Why did the Wampanoag do this? Why did they help the English settlers? Well, the Wampanoag needed alliances against their enemies. The Wampanoags are located right here in the village of Patuxet. The Wampanoag were not as decimated by disease as the Wampanoag were not as decimated by disease as the Narragansett were. Here's the Narragansett over here. And the Narragansett were threatening to move in on Wampanoag land. So they needed each other. The British and the Wampanoag needed each other. They made a treaty in 1621 that lasted for about 40 years until the devastating King Philip's War, which you'll learn about in the film. And they make a treaty. They're going to help each other. They're going to defend each other when threatened by enemies. And they're going to make each other richer. So the Wampanoag helped the English plant corn, trap fur, trade for goods. This is indeed in the first 20 years of the Pilgrims' existence in New England, the number one way they made money was fur trapping. And they exported the furs that the Indians caught to England. And they celebrated all this with a Thanksgiving in which they got together, and we know this. We're celebrating this very American celebration this week, or depending on when you watch this film. So, how did the English Wampanoag promise of the first Thanksgiving deteriorate into King Philip's War? Well, this is something covered in the film. So I hope you take all these things I discussed in this 20-minute introductory lecture into account when you learn how at first they got together in this sort of nervous, tenuous relationship, yet it deteriorated by 1676 into the leader of the Wampanoag, King Philip, also known as Metacom, the same guy, you'll see him in the film. From breaking bread in 1621 to King Philip's head, Metacom's head was put on a stake outside of the Plymouth colony for all to see, and warning all Indians that the English are here and you Indians are to submit. Thank you very much. We'll see you in